Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The subject today is that of the Akashic Records, mysterious proposition that somehow or the other the memory of mankind is retained in the precincts of this planet, and that this memory is embedded in emotional substance, the emotional substance coming from the actual experience that had occurred. We will go into the mechanics of that matter in detail a little later. The fact is that we are able to obtain records of the early history of this planet in numerous ways, and I'm just going to mention one or two. You have seen, of course, beetles, mosquitoes, and various other insects preserved for 30 or 40 million years in what we call resin, the gluey material secreted from the bark of trees, trapping sometimes insects from long ago. And they are very remarkable. Somehow the resin withdraws water from the creature and it remains perfectly embalmed. Then we have, of course, mammoths in ice that have been uncovered. These frozen records help us to fit in something of the pattern of the origins of life. Then we have, of course, recently discovered the 5,000 years old human on the borders of Austria and Italy, preserved by various fortuitous circumstances and a near perfect preservation, giving us such an extraordinary specimen of mankind. We ourselves are containers of the DNA molecule. The coding on this DNA molecule has existed for as long as mankind has existed on the planet. And it is there contained still within the fossils of humans and, of course, animals and primitive creatures, waiting for our investigation. It has been perhaps amusingly remarked that it might be possible one day to extract the DNA molecule of a dinosaur and allow the dinosaur's molecule to develop into a creature. Well, that lies way in the future. I'm one of those who believe that anything is possible to mankind. And I think that in the last 20, 30, 40 years even, we have seen evidence that man is going to be able to produce extraordinary changes and developments, unbelievable 100 years ago. I'm going to take you on some journeys into the world of record keeping, and I'm going to ask you to suppose that perhaps 2,000 years ago there may have been a pottery somewhere in ancient Greece, and a potter completing his work, and perhaps spinning the pot around and applying a stylus to it, and therefore getting a very fine groove all the way down on the pot. It is technically possible, or will be in the future, technically possible to spin the pot around today and with adequate equipment to be able to pick up the sounds of what was going on in that pottery 2,000 years ago. Our minds boggle at this sort of thing, but the technology for it is only just round the corner. And so we say that there is this capacity to pick up things from the past, The walls have ears, said Shakespeare, and indeed we accept that. There is ingrained in these walls something that has made them different from a few moments ago, and that sound may one day be able to be drawn off. Most of you know what psychometry is. Psychometry, the ability to pick up an object by certain sensitive individuals, some antique, which can be held in the hand of a psychometrist, and the events of the history of the object can be seen in the sacred square inch between the brows, or felt inwardly in the aura. And these people can give us remarkable images of the life history of some objects. Maybe a crown with rare gemstones on it, perhaps the crown of Charlemagne, which is still preserved, might one day come under the gaze of a psychometrist. Perhaps a court of ancient pharaohs may be trapped within a scarab ring that you have. A merchant and his caravan from Samarkand may have left behind a golden vase with that historic event embedded within it. A New York millionaire buying the Hope diamond bought trouble. Would he or should he have had it psychometrized in advance? And so on. Records lie everywhere. Is there a rationale for this? Is there something that could perhaps allay the suspicions in your mind that this is just pie in the sky? Well, you know what the esoteric teaching is, I'm sure, but let me just go into the matter a little further. You and I possess, as you well know, not only a physical body, but an etheric counterpart to the physical body, made up of subatomic particles, mainly what we call neutrinos, but many other subatomic particles as well. And this is the province of the yogi who knows very well that in the atmosphere of our planet there is trapped during sunlit periods the energy of prana, and that it is possible by breathing steadily to take this prana in and circulate it around this etheric body. The function of the etheric body is to vitalize the nervous system. The two great cerebral hemispheres, which make up the brain and spinal cord, are vitalized by this prana. Fascinating as that subject is, and the whole science of yoga which expresses it, we're not concerned with the etheric body today. What we are concerned with is a subtler substance still. Atoms, particles, wavicles, if you like to call them, of what we today refer to as quantum. By that we mean energy units, perhaps a million times tinier than an atom. These are being encountered by science today in the field of quantum. Well, we know by the same observation, which we call reading the Akashic Records, that this very tenuous matter, emotional matter, astral substance, if you like, is the matter of the astral world. We have an astral body made up of emotional substance interpenetrating the physical. Unlike the etheric body, the astral body can be detached from the physical and may be moved away from it. Millions of people are beginning to have an out-of-body experience in which the consciousness leaves the physical body behind in an astral envelope and can operate in an astral world. And that is what we're mainly concerned with here today, is the nature of the astral world and its contents. We say that our own little physical globe called the Earth, with its continents, that this globe is only the dense physical body of a much greater complex. We say that interpenetrating the earth is the anima mundi of the earth, an etheric envelope, very like the etheric body of man, interpenetrates his body. But we're concerned today with the astral world, a world of emotional substance which is immense. And the astral world is so great that it reaches almost as far as the moon in extent. Many, many thousands of times the volume of the physical body of the earth. Now, the astral world is mainly created by us. We are the emotional content of the earth globe. We are capable of generating emotional energy which can be laid down in emotional or astral substance way out into the astral world. As we express ourselves emotionally, we draw energy from the astral world through a chakra or force center that lies just below the diaphragm. We then take the emotional energy and we express it out of us in emotional confrontations, if you like, anger, sorrow, joy, and so on. And in so doing, we give off an effluent of this emotional used up material. And this material is collective, all mankind generates it, and it pours from the astral body into the astral world, exerting, as it were, a pressure or kind of atmosphere way out there in this immense globe, which is the astral world. The astral world is thrown into compartments, each with its own scenario. The scenario is often very reflective of the kind of emotional and physical life that you live on the earth. Somewhere in the astral world, there is a compartment that vibrates just to your aura, and when you leave the physical body in sleep, your astral body will tend to find itself in a particular compartment. Again, we're not concerned too much with the subject of out-of-body experience here today. We're looking for records, and the records exist in this astral world. The emotional experiences, especially when there are a group of humans involved in an actual traumatic experience, a festival, a happy experience of intense emotional effusion, then that record of the event is able to move out into the astral world. It will locate itself in an appropriate scenario, and there you have a record of that event. We call that the Akashic record of the event. The truth is that mankind has got a memory, and it is embedded in the astral world in these records. Science will say, well, where's the basis for this? Prove it to us, and so on. Today, we don't have to prove that there is such a thing as an astral body, that people frequently are able to come out of their bodies and move around in the astral world and report back about it. In fact, with the developments in clinical medicine today, many people who would normally die outright from a stroke or from heart failure are resuscitated, brought back to life, and report that in that period of 4 or 5 or 6 minutes in which they were virtually clinically dead, and the paramedics show that this was so, they had this experience of being in another world when their bodies were dead prior to them coming back into those bodies. And those reports have mounted into tens of millions, ladies and gentlemen. There's no question today that the consensus of opinion now is tending towards acceptance of an astral body that can leave the physical behind. We don't say, like science does, that consciousness is where your brain is. We say that consciousness can be 10,000 miles away from the body, from the brain, way out in the astral world. And it is therefore possible, we maintain, that for some of us, by dint of great discipline, to be able to reach out into the astral world and make contact with some of the Akashic records that lie way out there in that world. Times change, fashions change, and of course the nature of the astral world has changed as man's emotions have changed. 300 years ago, 400 years ago, people saw only devils and goblins and angels and cherubims in the astral world. Today it is a place much more like our own habitation on the earth at this time. And so we have now this concept of man producing an effluent from his aura, which collectively can constitute a record, a sensitive chemical plate, if you like, located somewhere out there in the astral world. But this kind of radiation is not new to us. We well remember Nagasaki and the Hiroshima debacle, in which atom bombs were exploded. And at the moment of disintegration of the nuclear content of the bomb, radiation escaped. And this radiation frequently impressed itself, marked itself in a matter of a split second on the bodies of the victims. Sometimes a person looking out of a window at the time would have the markings of the window frame embedded on the back or on the skin somewhere of the body. And if you can understand that concept, you'll begin to understand what we're getting at here. Where is the radiation? The radiation could well come from that background radiation, still measurable, still existent in our universe, which was released at the time of the Big Bang. We will hopefully have time for questions later on, and then we will, I'll try and elucidate what I have been saying. The esoteric teachings are quite clear, whether you go into Alice Bailey, whether you go to the Secret Doctrine of Theosophy, whether you study my books and others, you will find in the true classical stream of teachings, ancient wisdom, that there is mention of this Akasha, this extraordinary radiative force that exists interpenetrating our planet. Some have called it the astral light. Paracelsus called it the mysterium magicum. And it is in these extraordinary situations that the records of our planet are retained. Some are fading, some have never been dug out, and are completely mysterious to anybody who does reach them. In my early days, it interested me enormously to think that possibly by being able to reach into the astral world, either by projection or by using the third eye, to be able to see the events that might have occurred at the great Battle of Thermopylae, when 400 Spartans took on thousands of Persians and were completely annihilated. Or perhaps to watch the death of Socrates and other startling events which would have been embedded deeply in emotional matter by the very nature of their structure. Some of you will remember a ship called the Mare Celeste, a ship that set sail from New York with a cargo of alcohol in great big vats for Europe, and was not seen sailing with her crew again. What was discovered was a ship off Europe, off the coast of France, which had no crew. The ship was untampered with. There was no evidence of any drastic damage that could have caused this situation. It was taken over, it was boarded and brought to port, and the mystery has remained ever since. What was it on this ship that made the crew take to the single boat that there was, or leave it very quickly, perhaps under duress? Well, it was one of the first objectives that I had in searching the Akashic Records. What really did happen on the Mare Celeste? There had been a storm, and the storm had minor effects on the boat, but it had also affected the crew who had been under great pressure. One of the crew had had access to the alcohol on board, had become drunken, and had run amok. And this person had taken hold of a large hatchet on the ship and had menaced those on board. The total number of people on board was 9. One of them was a child, the child of the captain and his wife, and the rest were crew members. This person, in disarray, threatened them, and they had to take to the boat and leave the ship altogether. He then jumped into the sea himself, leaving the hatchet, taking the hatchet with him. And so that is just a simple suggestion of the true events that occurred on the ship, the Mare Celeste. Not a well-known matter today, but certainly 100 years ago, no one could speak about anything else. You may find other explanations, well and good, but those were what I gleaned from the Akashic Records. Then when we look at Stonehenge, these extraordinary trilithons, the 2 uprights with the crosspiece, this largest stone structure in Europe, not Africa, but in Europe. Extraordinary temple, possibly. In actual fact, the age of Stonehenge I had given out through observing it by means of the Akashic Records. And I gave out quite clearly that the Stonehenge stones, which means stones hanging from heaven, had been erected 5,000 years ago, and that the structure had been erected by the army of the plain of Salisbury at that time. It indicated, therefore, that there was some large development of civilization in the area for the merchants, for the community to be able to maintain an army. And the army built the Stonehenge under directions, and it took about 500 or 600 years to do it. Of course, Stonehenge represents the coming together of heliocentricity, that is an understanding that the Earth moves around the sun, and also the geocentricity of the Earth, and the two together represent cogs, if you like, meeting and rotating, and where the stones are placed, they indicate, as it were, conjunctions of these two systems. Now, up on the board, ladies and gentlemen, you will see a map of the Atlantic Ocean, which you will recognize quite easily: South America, North America, and of course Africa and Europe. And separating the two land masses is the strip of underwater structures called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And it has been the contention it has been the contention by esoteric teachers, and we include here Plato as the basis for our proposition, that once, 10,000 years ago and much, much longer back than that, there had existed a large island in the mid-Atlantic ridge. According to our best clairvoyance, this ridge extended from north to south, and that over a period of hundreds of thousands of years, the area of Atlantis, which was south, actually collapsed, sank beneath the waves. And progressively this happened to the whole land mass. But according to Plato, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, there was an island which some call Poseidonus, and this island also sank, submerged almost overnight, taking with it 2 or 3 million people. And it submerged in such a way as to not only sink rapidly, but to take its population with it and to sink into the Atlantic floor, the floor of the Atlantic. Now, is there any indication that this structure really existed? And we'll see why that's important in a moment. What we do know is that some civilization built pyramids, pyramidal structures, all around this area, even into Egypt. Pyramidal structures had been built by a civilization that we have no record of with regard to its origins. Let us go back 10, 12,000 years ago. Let us go back to Europe at that time. Europe at that time was under a great sheet of ice. A great sheet of ice. It was an ice age, and the sheet of ice came down as far as the Thames in Britain. And it had been there for many thousands of years. But suddenly, it disappeared. Suddenly, it disappeared. It is not there today, obviously. We have only the Arctic floating ice cap in its place. What actually caused this seems to have been Atlantis. You know that there is a Gulf Stream which comes out of this region and warms Britain and France, and even goes up the coast of America as well. We know about this today. It makes our lives more pleasant in Britain. But if there were such a landmass in or over the mid-Atlantic ridge, then it may well be that it was that landmass placed there that stopped the currents of the Sargasso Sea from reaching the shores of Europe, thereby ensuring an ice descent, as it were, well down into the continent. And that is the esoteric proposition, that the sudden submergence of Atlantis took away this barrier landmass, and the result was that the warm currents of the Gulf of Mexico swept upwards, touched the coasts of Europe and elsewhere, and the ice progressively retired. But there was another matter that I feel is a pointer to this, and that was the eels, which coming out of the Sargasso Sea were able to come to Europe still to this day, and to enter the streams flowing into the seas of Europe, around Europe, and to go up these streams and lay their eggs, and then to come down from these streams and never be seen again. What is the mystery of this phenomenon still existing today? Well, if we put Atlantis in position, then we can give an account, a reason for that. C.W. Leadbeater, the theosophical clairvoyant, had described the structure which was Atlantis before it submerged 10,000 years ago, according to Plato. My own observations confirm much of what Leadbeater said. The structure is shaped a little like Australia. It is a size that is much smaller than Australia, but it is placed more or less in this position and coincides with the most recent discoveries about the depth of the ocean and the nature of the Atlantic floor in that region. Now you can see where the Sargasso eels originally made for these great creeks and inlets, out of which there flowed waters from the highlands of Atlantis. And it was from there that they returned to their native grounds. Today, they still go in search of their spawning fields way up in France and elsewhere in Europe, but lack the material stored within their bodies to get back to their native homeland in the Sargasso Sea. And so they are lost. They are lost. However, the eggs, of course, hatch, and the young return to the Sargasso Sea, and so the process is still maintained. Now, these two suggestions that I have offered you here, coming from the Akashic Records, does imply that there is something in conflict between what science says and what the esoteric teaching says. I've looked at all the propositions about the magnetic fields changing on the floor of the Atlantic and the soil there and so on. I'll give you one more point that I pose or posit to science as being in favor of Atlantis. The diameter of the world is 8,000 miles. The diameter of the world is 8,000 miles. That means where the Atlantic Ocean is, we'll put it there, there is a space of 8,000 miles to the ocean on the opposite side of the Earth. Now, there are many parts of the mid-Atlantic ridge that are only 4,000 or 5,000 feet, barely a mile, below the surface of the Atlantic. Are you going to tell me that out of a diameter of 8,000 miles, it would not be possible for that diameter to vary 1 or 2 miles in either direction, according to various cycles, volcanic upheavals, and so on? Of course it's possible for that variation to occur. It has occurred in the past, and it will occur again. 1 mile or 2 miles out of 8,000 is not a great variation. So this is the subject of Atlantis. Of course, the purpose of my searching for evidence of Atlantis is mainly to discover what time period Atlantis really exists. Personally, I don't accept the suggestion that Atlantis existed 1 million or more years ago. I would, however, accept propositions that it did exist, say, 200,000 years ago, which is an immense matter anyway. You can see from the drawings that I have presented here that if such a civilization did exist on Atlantis, they would be a maritime nation. They would have their ships able quite easily to reach the places that I am arrowing now. If you have a look at the drawing that was handed out to you, it shows Leadbeater's observations of North Africa at the time, and he suggested that North Africa had a great sea stretching across it right as far as Egypt. There was this great sea, and that it was quite easy for ships from Atlantis to sail across the shallow sea over the Sahara Desert and to reach the shores of Egypt, where today we have the best remaining examples of pyramid structures there. There is so much in favor of Atlantis that I was quite happy to accept that proposition long before I set out on confirming it by means of the Akashic Records. Then we must look at this extraordinary matter of Jonathan Swift, who, as you wrote, wrote Gulliver's Travels in 1726. And in Gulliver's Travels, he talks about a race who had been observing Mars and had seen 2 moons orbiting Mars. At the time that he wrote, there were no telescopes capable of reaching Mars and observing these structures. Not only did he pronounce this, but he also gave the times of their revolution of Mars. The one took 10 hours, and the other took 21.5 hours. This all turned out to be accurate when 150 years later, the first telescopes were able to sight these moons moving around Mars. I've heard some puerile explanations for how he was able to obtain such information, but there is no evidence whatever for those puerile explanations. And so one asks about matters like this, where you have an extraordinary person like Jonathan Swift depicting in his travels all kinds of criticisms of society, whether he had not this ability as well. And I now would like to refer you to the region of the Mexican Gulf, because science's attention has recently been focused on this area. According to records, it seems as if a giant meteor struck this region. Some say 60 million years ago, perhaps 50 million, but between the two. According to scientific observation and tests, the concept is that the meteor struck this region called the Yucatan Peninsula. It was an enormous structure, almost 100 miles across. The effect of it was to throw up all kinds of material that put the Earth into a nuclear winter. The sun was blotted out for a long period of time, and with no sun, the plants began to starve to death, and with the plants starving to death, the great dinosaurs who need tons of vegetation to exist at all, they also met their end. Not all of them, but some of them. My own observation of this phenomenon, and it will become patent soon, perhaps in the next 10 years, was that the meteor did hit this region, but it struck the area of the Persian, Mexican Gulf. And what happened was that this area had low-lying land on it, being deposited there from various rivers coming down from the Rockies and mountains in this region of Mexico, struck there and threw up a wall, a huge region of mud, which formed the Yucatan Peninsula. The Yucatan Peninsula will obviously be open to investigation, and it will be found that none of the material there originated there, but had come from elsewhere. And that is the observation which I made of this meteor striking that region. Yucatan was thrown up as the result of it. Now, while we're on this area of the Central America, let me tell you about another great mystery, which was much more prevalent, of course, around about the time that it occurred in the 1920s and 30s. A British explorer called Colonel Fawcett, a man who had much experience both as a soldier and also as an explorer, had examined the territory of Brazil in the region of the Mato Grosso, deep within Brazil. He had gone there several times, and he was completely aware of the dangers. He had survived these expeditions, and finally he came out and talked about a great city that lay between São Paulo and this region that he had explored in the Mato Grosso, which means large forests. And the place that he was talking about, he called Zed, a lost city of Brazil, which housed extraordinary structures, much of which would help us to substantiate the existence of an Atlantean mother civilization that could have created a city there. And so when he came out on this occasion, he approached the Geographical Society, who sponsored him to go and look for it, to go and find that city, and also a syndicate of North American newspapers assisted as well. He took with him his son, who was 19 or 20, and his son's friend, who was a giant of a man, 6'2" or so, and they landed in São Paulo in, I think it was 1925, and took the long train journey up to Caramba, then followed the course of a big river there, I'll get the name later on, and finally got to a region of intense bush country. He was never seen of or heard of again. He wrote a few letters home to his wife in London, and some accounts that went to the syndicate for publication and to the Geographical magazine. He himself was never seen again. And exploration after exploration went into the jungles to try and find him. No luck. Some of these expeditions are still going into that area of the jungle. And one was almost wiped out a few months ago when 16 of its members were kidnapped by a local Indian tribe, a very dangerous area. But he said he had never feared it and would not be worried by the exploration he was undertaking. And so they searched for him and couldn't find him. His son and friend had decided to return to England, had turned about and retraced their steps, but they were murdered by savage tribes en route. That is known, or is believed to be known. The search for Colonel Fawcett's bones, for any evidence of where he once was or where he died, has continued. Bones discovered by American Army official proved not to be his, and an albino child, Indian child, that was presented for inspection, said to be the child of Colonel Fawcett and an Indian woman, was shown to be just that, an albino, and not the result of commingling of white and Indian blood. And so the mystery remains. My own perception through Akashic Records was that after his son and friend left the party behind, he became very friendly with the tribe that he was with. He led them to a region of the forest which abutted a river. He was probably the first one to suggest it. They burnt the trees down in a huge area and planted crops under his direction. They fashioned a village there, and he himself went native. He decided that he would not return. He had not found Zed, the lost city. His own aspirations were towards assisting this tribe who had looked after him so well. And eventually he died there of natural causes. Very quickly the forest consumes anything that is built in it. Whether they will ever find this place, I don't know. I'm merely recalling it through the Akashic Records because I'm sure some of you would find it interesting. The last item that I have time for now is to refer you to the authorship of the Shakespearean material. The authorship of the Shakespearean material is, of course, hotly debated through the years. Debated with suggestions that it was Francis Bacon who had written the Shakespearean plays and presumably the sonnets as well. My investigation of the whole drama involved in the presentation of the writings was helped by my having had a life in the area of Stratford-on-Avon at that particular time. And so for me, the records were much easier to obtain than usual. The true author of Shakespeare was a yeoman, and he lived as a farmer, and he had many fine horses. He lived in the region of a village called Shottery, near Stratford-on-Avon. The house that he occupied, the farmhouse that he occupied, for a yeoman means a farmer, was very near to the Hathaways. The Hathaways had a cottage in Shottery, just outside of Stratford as well, and he was great friends with the Hathaway family. This man was called Richardson, John Richardson. He is a historic figure in that he is mentioned once or twice in the records of the day associated with Shakespeare. The Hathaways, as I said, were close neighbors and friends. And when the father of the household of Hathaways suddenly died, John Richardson helped the family along and gave them good advice. John had his own small family. He was a widower with 4 children. Now, Anne Hathaway, the eldest daughter of the Hathaway family, was 26 years old, and she had a gentleman caller, a boyfriend by the name of Will Shakespeare, whose father was a glove maker in Stratford. Will Shakespeare put her in the family way, and then naughtily went off and became engaged to an Anne Whatley in another village. The Hathaways asked John Richardson to help them, and Richardson, who had a second job as a courier, he was in charge of horses that were made up the postal system in England in that day. He knew all about horses, and he kept teams of them, and he was a courier himself. And so he called Will Shakespeare to him and persuaded him rather harshly that he had to stand by Anne Hathaway. And so, taking a friend with him, they rode by horseback to Worcester, where Richardson put up a sum of £40, which is today would be about £5,000, to guarantee the establishment of the banns at the Worcester parish. The banns being, of course, for the marriage of Will Shakespeare to Anne Hathaway. Much of this is history that you can look up for yourself. Richardson was an extraordinary person. He rode around the country not only as a courier, delivering letters to the innkeepers, who were the postmen of the day, but he also carried furniture by cart and so on. He therefore came into contact in these inns, where he often stayed over, with travelers from all over the world, sailors from Bristol, soldiers returning from the continental wars, gentlemen of all ranks, and so on. And it was here that he heard the constant flow of stories of the outside world, not just of that, but of England as well, history. He was a great avid reader of historical records, and he began to write these stories down. There was another feature in his life, and that was that actors kept coming up to Kenilworth, nearby Kenilworth Castle, and they would present their plays there, and he would avidly attend these plays, with friends, of course, making friends even with the actors. And he was not always impressed with the quality of plays being presented at Kenilworth and the theatre there. He thought he could do better with his own writing. And so he began to turn the stories into scenes and acts. And it was then that he found Shakespeare useful. Will had no particular occupation at all, but had been down to London once or twice acting for Richardson. Now Will had come back and had read some of these acts and pieces of plays that Richardson had been writing. And he said, this stuff is better than what I've seen at the theatres, the Globe and so on, in London. And so they began to put together these materials that John Richardson had written out after visits and hearing the stories in inns. He would write them out on the long winter nights and in scrolls, place them in a big barrel, open-ended barrel, near to him. And so this thing was jammed with scrolls. And they began to put these things together, and Will Shakespeare took them up to London. And they were a great success. And he would come back again and again making suggestions for the next play, what could be done to it, to improve it, to make it popular amongst the London public. And so this was the birth of the Shakespearean plays, so-called. Richardson would not go up to London. He had interests at Stratford-on-Avon and Shottery, which retained him there. I have written this all down in my book, which you have a blurb about, handed out to you. But now I want to refer to the private side of John Richardson's life. he was a person who was obsessed with beauty, and poetry was one of the things that he loved most. And he had written down the personal, the private side of his life, the emotional side of his life. He had written it down in terms of sonnets, about 140 so-called Shakespearean sonnets. And they were his heart poured out. He had also written, under Shakespeare's suggestion, a poem called Venus and Adonis, which had been presented by them to the Earl of Southampton, the man called Henry Wriothesley. And so he had become established already as a poet. His plays began to work in London. They were a tremendous success. Amongst these sonnets is one particular sonnet that anybody who grew up in schools which touched on Shakespeare knows about. It was called the Sonnet to the Dark Lady. According to the sonnet, it was directed in praise of this dark, very dark, dark person. The boffins of Shakespeare, those who go and sit and study books and things about the times, concluded that this dark woman was a court female, a woman high up in the court, and that she was dark-skinned, perhaps Spanish or Moorish or something of that order. Well, in fact, and to prove the point that I'm making here, the fact is that the sonnet was not addressed to a lady at court. It was addressed to another lady, and this lady was one of Richardson's mares. He had many horses, and there was one horse that he adored more than any other. And this was a mare that he called Black Beauty. And when you allow me to read the sonnet, which I'm looking for now at the moment, you've all got the copy that I haven't got. Perhaps I better borrow one from one of you. First of all, I want to refer you to the most important thing of all, and that is a conversation between the Constable of France, the Duke of Bourbon, and Orleans, from Henry V, Act 3, in which one of them says, "I once wrote a sonnet in his praise. I have heard a sonnet begin so to one's mistress. Then did they imitate that which I composed to my courser, for my horse is my mistress." Now you tell me whether this poem is addressed to a beautiful lady at court, or whether it is addressed to the beauteous animal that was the apple of Richardson's eye. This is how it goes. "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips are red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dung." Not a nice thing to say about a lady, is it? That her breasts were like dung. "If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head." Not a compliment either, is it, to say that the lady's hair was like wires. "I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. In some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath from my mistress reeks." How could they be so stupid as to believe this was addressed to a woman at court? "I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as anything she belied with false compare." Now, if you can tell me that that is addressed to a nice lady at court, well, I'll give everything up. And so they go on churning the material out about this sonnet and others, proving that Will Shakespeare had done this and done that, when in actual fact it was John Richardson. Now, before Sir Lawrence Olivier died, I had sent him my book, and he had obviously read it, because one of these boffins rang him up and said, "Oh, I've just written a new book about who the Dark Lady at court is." And Laurence Olivier told him that the whole thing had been blown. Somebody had discovered that the sonnet was addressed to a horse and that he shouldn't go on wasting his time saying it was somebody at court. Ladies and gentlemen, if you can believe what I have just shown you there now, you can believe that the circumstances that I have described about the true authorship are correct, because they came from both the same source. I hope you'll have a look at a book at my counter to do with this, and thank you very much for coming along today.